All right, so here are a few big questions to think about. First of all, is Canada a place of equal opportunity for economic success? Is Canada a place where people can start from a place of poverty and become wealthy? And is it a place where people who are born into wealth can fall all the way down? And or is it a place where things are just pretty much equal overall? And what about the US? How does Canada compare to the US? Are things more or less equal in the US compared to Canada? And why might that be if there are some differences? And what about capitalism in general? What about that type of way of life? Do we see these differences? Do we see inequality because of what capitalism is? And do we see it as a problem, or do we see it as something to work around or to turn to our advantage? So these are the types of questions we're going to be thinking about in this section. So we're going to be talking about social stratification. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, so social stratification. So what are we talking about? I'm just going to read the definition I came up with here. It's loosely based on the textbook, but a little bit different. So, a social pattern of unequal distribution of resources based on various social characteristics. So, and then there's 4 different dimensions we can discuss. So one of the big parts about that is that it's something that is social. So we're not just interested in this thought of, oh, maybe a handful of people are wealthy, a handful of people are poor, and it's just sort of random and it's based on what people do or don't do. We're thinking about society as a whole in a macro way, which is why the 2 main theories we'll end up discussing on this would be structural functionalism and class conflict theory. We'll also touch on the other theories, but that's the main thing, these 2 kind of very macro theories. So we're going to be talking about societies as a whole and kind of analyzing them. Okay, and as well, we're looking at this thought, well, does it matter if a person is born into wealth, born into a middle class circumstance, born into poverty? What kind of impact does that have on their chances for success? And one of the arguments as we go back to that image is that maybe it's not always just about people doing, it's not just about people jumping into their lives and becoming successful or becoming less successful, but maybe there are more things that we need to take into consideration. Okay. So one of the other things is that this stratification, we find it in really all societies, in all places, in all times. There's always this effort to distinguish some people from others based on these different social characteristics. And by social characteristics, we could be talking about race, we could be talking about caste, we could be talking about gender, we could be talking about a whole host of other different things, the different ways that people have distinguished themselves from others over time. Okay, but these are things that vary in different societies in different places. So actually, if we look at smaller scale societies, if we look at hunter-gatherer societies, for example, these societies were a bit more equal overall than a lot of societies that we see today, because one of the arguments that actually Marx made about these hunter-gatherer societies is that you needed your hunters to you needed your hunters to go out hunting and to get the meat, and the main kind of source of that protein for people, but you also needed the gatherers to gather the fruit. You needed both of those things, and people needed both of those in order to function as a society. And so Marx made the claim that because both of those things had so much value, that there was less inequality in those types of societies than in many of the other ones we've seen over time through history. Okay, and we'll come back to that a little bit later on. Now, one of the most interesting points about this is that stratification, social stratification, if it's going to exist in a large scale within a society, which it needs to if we're talking about social stratification, it means people have to accept it. They need to, as a whole, people need to say, this is fair, this is what we deserve. We deserve to have wealth, we deserve to have poverty, we deserve the place where we're in our lives. So this is an interesting thing. So we can think of, for example, something called the divine right of kings. So, and this was the belief in societies based on a monarchy. A lot of times those were tied into the religious beliefs of those communities. And they made the claims that their kings were basically chosen by their God to rule. And that is why they should rule, why they should have all the wealth, why they should have all the power, is because that was their religion that made that claim. Or we can also, sometimes people will talk about slavery here. Or, sorry, actually, let's move on. Let's switch that. We'll come back to this idea of slavery in a moment. But we can also talk about India and the caste system. So, and this is an often used example, but India has long had this history of the caste system where the family that you're born into, that is the type of life that you will end up in. So that there are certain types of jobs that you will do, certain types of people you will meet, and certain types of experiences you'll be able to have or not have based on that. So in these societies, why would people accept this? One of the claims, the reason why people would accept this is because of the way that the Hindu religion was taught within some of these societies, that it was based on this idea of reincarnation, that people, basically, the life you're born into is the life you deserve to have. So the people who are wealthy, successful today, it is because in a past life they had done really great things. And whereas people who were born into poverty, that maybe they had not done things as well, and that also maybe they could improve their situation and move up into the future. So this is an interesting one to think about, this claim, and it may be controversial as well to think about it this way. But if that's the case, if you believe that you're where you deserve to be, you're not going to necessarily want to fight against it to say, hey, I don't think this is fair, I want things to be different, right? So then the question is, what about in a capitalist society? Are there beliefs that justify inequality within capitalism, and what are they then? And that's something that we'll be discussing as well. All right, so let's move on here. So there are two kind of big ways we can distinguish this kind of stratification, this economic stratification that we see in different societies. So in some societies, we see something like the caste system, and in other societies, we see something more like the class system. Okay, and so I've already kind of discussed the caste system in India, just very briefly, of course. It's an oversimplification for sure. But we can also use slavery here as an example of a caste system, and a different way of thinking about it too. So in a caste system, the stratification is based on birth. So you're divided between wealth and poverty based on the family that you're born into. So if you're born to a slave, you're going to become a slave as well, right? Or if you're born to a wealthy slave owner, you're going to become a slave owner and be wealthy as well. So this is a caste system. It's a closed system. And actually, there's something I just want to go back to, actually. I'm just going to go back to the slide for a moment and mention why I have this triangle here. And it's part of this kind of question about inequality that we need to think about. So generally, in these hierarchies, it's not that many people are wealthy and satisfied and that a few people are not. in most cases, the number of people who are wealthy and successful within societies, they make up a small percentage of people at the top. And it gets bigger as you go down, and the majority tend to end up in a lower state, and that there are more people who are poor than people who are wealthy. So that's something to be visualizing, that this is part of the thought that maybe there needs to be a justification for this, that a society might need to provide something like this. Okay, now moving back over here to class. Okay, so again, actually, so with caste, it's a closed system, meaning it's almost impossible to move from one caste to another. It's almost impossible to move from slavery to not being a slave until there's a period of transition and a change in society, or a potential escape or something like that. Now, a class system is different. So this is a type of economic difference that is based on two things. It's based on birth and it's based on individual achievement. So this means that the family you're born into is going to have an effect. And we'll talk about more about what we mean by that. But it's also about individual achievement. So there is this belief that someone can go from a place of poverty to a place of wealth by making the right choices, doing the right things, taking the right steps to advance themselves. So it's a more open system where people have the potential to change their experience. So you can see, hopefully you can see the difference between these two here, these two kind of significant differences. Now there's another term that I want to discuss, and this is something called a meritocracy. So a meritocracy is this idea that you could have a society where success is purely based on personal merit, that it's based on how good a person is, or how hard they work, or how much ability they just innately have, that people become successful because of who they are, that there could be a society like this. So the question is it possible to have a society like this? And do we see examples of it anywhere around us or through history? And what about the society that we live in? Or actually, let me clarify. Some of us may be temporarily here, or we may be traveling to other places. But Canada, for example, is Canada a meritocracy? If people try hard enough or just innately have some kind of ability, are they going to be successful? So think about that. Think about your kind of thoughts and responses to that. All right. So one claim that I would make, and it is actually a quote from another sociology textbook here too, is that true meritocracy has never been fully realized in any society. That there's always a certain amount of inequality that makes it more likely that some people will succeed where others struggle. And think about that. Think if you can think of any examples that really contradict this. Also imagine a society where it is all just based on what people do. And also what that would even mean. And could we even visualize a society like that? So, and here's a quote as well from the other textbook here. And it says, "Nothing affects social standing as much as birth into a particular family, which has a strong bearing on future schooling, occupation, and income." So this is a pretty strong claim here. So this is saying that absolutely the family that you're born into or adopted into, or whatever those circumstances are, the family that you end up growing up kind of experiencing a world with, whether that's a foster family or another type of family, that it's going to shape your whole experience in life. And they make this claim by saying that it affects the type of school that you go to. And this includes elementary schools and high schools, but absolutely university as well. And the types of quality of the education you receive, which is going to shape the types of careers you're able to move into, the opportunities you'll be able to have. And for those who end up taking out student loans to go into these universities as well, Then there's also that barrier of paying back that student loan that others don't necessarily experience. And then, so these are things that we need to think about. And so one of the claims is that a lot of times it's fairly subtle, the ways that some people develop their success compared to others. We don't necessarily know all of the different ways that this happens. Occasionally, there's cases where it becomes very clear. As we saw in the last couple of years, there were these cases that came out of celebrity parents, wealthy parents in the United States that were actually bribing their way for their children to enter prestigious universities and colleges in the US. So some of the prominent cases included Felicity Huffman, who was from Desperate Housewives and some other shows as well as Lori Loughlin from Full House and Fuller House. And these women, along with their partners, particularly in Lori Loughlin's case, they did bribe with substantial amounts of money. They bribed different officials. They did things like paying for someone else to take the SATs for their children. They also did things like pretending that their children were athletic and were on these different sports teams when they didn't have these particular skills. That there are these types of things that happened, and it was this whole collection of celebrities that were brought into this, and it found out it was part of this widespread issue. So, and now they've faced some criminal consequences for their actions as well, with some small jail terms, which is interesting to think about too. But in any case, it's an example where it is quite obvious. But the question is, how often is it a lot more subtle than this? How often do we see advantages from a particular circumstance someone has versus disadvantages that someone else has? Okay. So, class mobility. What are we talking about? We are talking about the ability for someone to move from a very low class to a very high class. In theory, we can also be talking about just moving from, so for example, we could break it down into five levels of classes. So we could talk about the very wealthy at the top and the extremely poor at the bottom. And then we have our different kind of middle classes in between, our different levels of middle class in between. We could look at it that way. And if we're talking about it that way, and we're talking about class mobility, it is very unlikely, even within Canada, for someone to go from extreme poverty to extreme wealth. It's very unlikely for someone to make that kind of leap. It's also very unlikely for someone who is very wealthy, born into privilege, to go all the way down to the bottom. There are cases where this happens, but they are uncommon. Okay, and we'll be looking at some more specific statistics in our class on Wednesday about this. But one thing to note is that it does vary across the provinces, across the different locations within Canada, how much mobility there is. It also depends on if we're talking about someone's ability to move up and down in their own lifetime versus from their parents to their own generation. And also, if we compare to the US, it is about twice as likely that someone can go from extreme poverty to extreme wealth in Canada compared to the US. So there are some significant differences that we can make there. But what are some of the reasons maybe why people don't necessarily move from the bottom to the top in particular? So there's three factors we can consider. So one of those is, of course, ascribed wealth. So as we mentioned before, on the last week, we talked about ascribed versus achieved statuses. And so we're talking about someone who's they're born as a son, or they just end up in this position as nothing to do with themselves as a person and their skills. So ascribed wealth means just being born into wealth and privilege. So if someone is born into wealth and privilege, what does that mean for them? It means they'll probably get a quality education, right, based on the schools from where they live, or maybe they'll even be sent to another school if those schools are deemed inadequate. They might get tutors and things like that if they need assistance. They might They might do a whole variety of things, that there are certain kind of advantages that they might have. They might be put into different programs that are beneficial for their education, that type of thing. So there's that, there are those things. And of course, being able to pay for higher education without a struggle, these types of things. Okay, so there's that. And to think about, for example, just to imagine if someone is born, if their father is the king, right away in a monarchy, that puts that person into that place of privilege, to that place where maybe they will be the next king or queen, right? So it's something that is just there that happens. And so one of the biggest ways within capitalism that we're talking about this is the question of inheritance as well, that that the wealth that the family makes, that it gets passed down to the children. And of course, in some cases, there's not going to be wealth. Maybe there's going to be debt that's passed down instead. Okay. And as well, there's the question of social capital. So this is essentially just saying, well, who do you know? And are they someone who is, are they people who will benefit you knowing them? Are they people who have connections to different business opportunities? And in here, we could talk a lot. There's actually a branch of social theory that looks at elite theories, and it talks about these kind of elite networks that people make up. So a lot of times the people who are very wealthy, they have connections with politicians, and a lot of times the politicians are also wealthy. For example, we can think of Canada's own Trudeau and his connections with his father as well. So there are things like this that we can talk about. We also have business leaders, for example, in the US, business leaders who jump into political positions. So we have this kind of intermingling of elites and this kind of elite social circles that they run in, and the way that sometimes political movements, that a lot of times are based on corporate donations, on very wealthy individuals, things like that. So those are things that need to be considered. Whereas someone who's in a place of poverty and struggle, they're not necessarily going to have those networks or know how to make those kind of connections. And of course, there's also the question of knowledge, of knowing the proper ways to act and think, and the conversations to have, and the rules that we need to follow. So it's thinking about, so we're talking about cultural capital, and here we're talking about, are there particular norms that are expected of someone who is wealthy that maybe someone who wouldn't necessarily know how to perform? So what I always tend to think of is to imagine someone who starts off in a place of poverty, who maybe just eats their ramen noodles out of a styrofoam cup in their childhood, and they're put into this opportunity to go to this fancy meal. Are they going to know how to eat this meal? Are they going to know what fork to use? Are they going to know what order to do things, the type of polite conversation that they should be having? Are they going to know what the right kind of proper things are to say? Whereas someone who's born into wealth, they're more likely to have a sense of what's expected in that circumstance. Right, so those are some things to think about on this question of mobility. All right, and so in our next video, we are going to be contrasting the two main theories that we're talking about today: structural functionalism, class conflict theory, or Marxism, and their looks on economic inequality. All right, so I'll see you in the next video.